Hello, and welcome back to the Sleeping Shogun. Tonight we are traveling far back, before there were emperors or warriors or even names, to the very beginning of the world, when the islands of Japan were still soft and unformed, rising slowly from a quiet sea of mud and salt. Together, we will drift through the oldest stories the country remembers. The gods who churned the ocean into land, the goddess who walked into the country of the dead, the silent moon who ruled the night by doing nothing at all. Everyone knows a little of these gods, a shrine visited as a child, a name half remembered from a story. But tonight there is nothing to learn and nothing to hold on to. We are only here to let these old, slow tales carry us somewhere quiet. If you enjoy these journeys into Japan's long nights, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what the hour is where you are. It is a quiet comfort to know the night is shared. Now, get comfortable, adjust your pillow, let the weight settle out of your shoulders, and let your breathing slow to the rhythm of the tide. You do not need to hold on to every name or every date. Let them drift past you like the sound of that far-off sea. Now, let the night settle around you, and let us begin. Before there was a world, there was only a sea of mud. Before there was a world, there was only a sea of mud. It was a beginning without a horizon, a thick and silent expanse where the elements of water and earth had not yet discovered how to part from one another, remaining locked in a cold, heavy sleep. There was no wind to stir the surface, no moon to mark the passing of an hour, and no sun to cast a shadow. The old scribes, dipping their brushes into ink centuries later, would try to capture this stillness by speaking of a time when heaven and earth were not yet separated. But the older, domestic memory of the provinces remained more fluid, describing a universe that began not with a grand design, but with the slow and silent ripening of the ground itself. Out of the very density of the mud, the first things began to move. Not with the sudden crack of thunder, but with the imperceptible patience of a reed shoot pushing its way upward through the wet clay, seeking a sky that did not yet exist. The earliest gods born into this stillness were shapes without bodies, names that drifted through the quiet like smoke before vanishing into the upper layers of the dark. They did not build temples or demand sacrifices. They simply occurred, marking the transition from a world that was entirely empty to a world that was beginning to notice its own existence. Kojiki tells us of Amenominakanushi, the god who stood at the very middle of the sky when the universe first parted, a deity who emerged in silence and then retreated so completely that the subsequent stories forgot to give him anything to do. He remained entirely still within the center of the first morning, a brief and solitary presence who vanished before the first shoreline had been drawn. This sudden, quiet exit left an immense clearing in the architecture of the sky, a deliberate vacancy at the very threshold of creation. The true weight and meaning of that empty center would be questioned much later, in the long centuries to come, when other gods arrived to take rule over the divisions of the earth. But for now, the silence was simply the air that the early world breathed. The work of making that world solid fell to the last two deities of that long, unrecorded line, Izanagi and Izanami, the male and female who were given the task of bringing the wet clay into its proper boundaries. They stood together upon the floating bridge of heaven, looking down into the gray and featureless soup below them. The bridge itself was less a path than a threshold, a place where the light of the upper world met the rising damp of the lower country. They carried with them a single tool, a jeweled spear, heavy with the weight of the early sky. It was not a weapon meant for a war that had not yet been conceived, but a stick for testing the depth of the dark. Izanagi lowered the point through the clouds, thrusting it down into the thick brine, and began to churn the water. The sound it made was a low, heavy swirling, the first domestic noise in a universe that had known only the silence of the marsh. For a long time, the mud resisted them, clinging to the jewels on the shaft with a heavy, stubborn inertia. But as he lifted the blade back toward the light, a single drop of brine, thickened by its long sleep in the dark, fell from the tip of the spear. It struck the surface with a small, hollow sound, and as it touched the water, the salt hardened into stone, forming the first solid ground in the vast, unstable sea. They called it Onogoro, the island that had made itself, a small patch of dry earth no larger than a garden, where the two gods could finally step down and rest their feet. If you travel to the islands that grew from that first stone today, you will still encounter the scent that Izanagi and Izanami found when they stepped off the heavenly bridge. On certain spring mornings, when the mist hangs low over the rice terraces of the interior, the air smells of a wet, iron-rich clay and the sharp, green bitterness of young moss. It is a scent that feels remarkably old, a sensory reminder that beneath the concrete of the modern cities, the earth remains a damp and newly turned thing. There's a small community in the mountains of central Japan where the potters still dig their clay from the same deep veins that their grandfathers used. And they say that when the raw earth is first pulled from the dark, it smells exactly like the wind that blew before the trees had names. It is an ordinary sort of smell, practical and heavy with moisture, a sign that the sacred in this landscape has always lived in the dirt rather than the stars. Upon that small island, the two gods did what all travelers do when they find themselves in a new place. They built a house, and they looked at one another. They set up a central pillar, a great wooden post that reached from the floor to the roof, anchoring the roof against the wind that was beginning to blow across the new sea. They walked around that pillar in opposite directions, a slow and formal circle that was the first human contract. When they met on the other side, the woman spoke first, praising the beauty of the man she saw before her. But the world, it seems, was not yet ready for its own praise. The child born from that first meeting was a creature without bones, a soft and fluid thing they called Hiruko, the leech child, who could not stand upon the new rock. They placed him in a boat woven from reeds and let the current carry him out into the gray water, a small, white speck that vanished into the distance before the day was half through. It was an early encounter with that quiet, enduring sorrow that comes from understanding that even the things made by gods are subject to a sudden and gentle breaking. The later poets would call this quality mono no aware, the realization that every beginning carries its own vanishing within it, like the salt that dissolves in the pot to make the broth savory. They went back to the floating bridge to ask the older gods what had gone wrong, and the answer they received was as dry and practical as the mud itself. The man should have spoken first. The order of things could not be hurried or turned upside down without leaving a seam where the water could leak through. It was an early encounter with that quiet, enduring sorrow that comes from understanding that even the things made by gods are subject to a sudden and gentle breaking. The later poets would call this quality mono no aware, the realization that every beginning carries its own vanishing within it, like the salt that dissolves in the pot to make the broth savory. They went back to the floating bridge to ask the older gods what had gone wrong, and the answer they received was as dry and practical as the mud itself. The man should have spoken first. The order of things could not be hurried or turned upside down without leaving a seam where the water could leak through. And so they returned to the island, and they walked around the pillar once more. This time, Izanagi spoke before the shadow could cross his wife's face, and when they came together, the earth beneath their feet began to widen. They brought forth the first true land of the archipelago, beginning with the long ridge of Awaji that sat like a green shield in the mouth of the bay, before bringing forth the curved back of Shikoku, the mountainous spine of Kyushu, and the vast, forested expanse of Yamato. They were not grand continents, but narrow strips of rock and green timber, places where the mountains were always within sight of the sea, and the sound of the water was never entirely out of the ears. The creation was finished, but it was an architecture built upon the memory of the mud, a landscape that knew, from its first hour, how easily the solid earth can soften back into the dark if the silence is ever broken in the wrong way. She went down into the dark, and he could not bring her back. Before the newly formed mountains had even settled their green shoulders into the mist, the small, unwritten geography of human grief was already being traced in the damp soil. It remains one of the quietest ironies of the early world that the first deity to know the weight of death was the mother of the land itself, and that she was brought down to the earth by the very fire she had delivered into the light. In the ancient records, the exact place where her breathing stopped remains divided, as if the landscape could not quite agree on where its first major sorrow should be anchored. The compilers of the Kojiki wrote that she was laid to sleep on Mount Hiba, on the misty, cloud-torn borders of the Izumo country, while the later scribes of the Nihon Shoki preferred to point their long brushes toward Kumano in the south, where the ancient pines run straight down into the cold, gray belly of the sea. If you travel to that southern shore today, to the place that modern maps call Hana no Iwaya, you will not find a temple built of heavy timber or a roof of thatched straw. You will find only an immense wall of rock, 45 meters high, rising like a frozen wave out of the green dirt, where there is no inner hall to enter, because the stone itself is the monument, a sharp and silent space where the ordinary world simply stops and demands to be looked at. Twice a year, the people of the coast still gather at the foot of this cliff, bringing long braided ropes woven from hemp that are decorated with wild flowers and seasonal leaves, which they carry up the paths to hang from the high lip of the stone down to the earth below. They play small flutes made of bamboo, long, high-pitched notes that carry over the constant rattle of the shore pebbles, and they perform their slow dances without ever turning their backs to the rock. It is an old and stubborn habit, a collective gesture carried forward through 13 centuries that has very little to do with modern theology and everything to do with the sheer persistence of memory, surviving as the physical shadow of a grief that began before the language had even settled into its permanent shapes. The old stories tell us that Izanagi could not endure the sudden, cold domesticity of a house without her voice. A man who has spent his hours shaping the coastlines of a nation does not easily understand that there is a border his own feet cannot cross. And so he turned his back on the sun and walked down into the sloping dark of Yomotsu Hirasaka, the long, flat hill that leads to the country of the dead. In the modern imagination, the underworld is almost always pictured as a place of grand, subterranean architecture, of iron gates and roaring rivers of black fire. But the old text treats the place with a far drier, colder simplicity. When he reached the palace at the end of the path, he found only a vast, low-roofed structure where the air smelled of wet clay and old soot. And he did not see his wife at first, but spoke instead through the thick, unplaned wood of a closed door, his voice echoing in the small enclosure like a dry autumn leaf scraping across stone. "The lands we were making are not yet finished," he told the dark, his hand resting on the cold timber. "Come back with me." From behind the wood, her voice returned to him, though it had already lost much of its moisture, sounding like the flat, clear voice of a traveler who has already accepted the logic of a very long journey. She told him that she had already eaten from the hearth of that lower country, and that when one tastes the salt of the dead, the blood naturally slows down to match the rhythm of the shadows. Yet she promised to go and speak with the older deities of the place to see if the ledger could be opened once more. Her only condition was a slight one, the kind of small, domestic rule that appears in every ancient tale just before the world breaks. He must remain in the dark of the passage, and he must not look into her room while she was gone. Patience is a modern luxury, born of clocks and steady light, but to the early gods, time was merely a weight that grew heavier the longer one stood without moving. As the hours went out like lamps in the passage, the silence of the great house became a physical pressure against Izanagi's skin, until his fingers moved of their own accord, reaching up to break a single, thick tooth from the wooden comb that held his hair. He struck a fire upon its tip, turning the wood into a tiny, flickering torch, and stepped over the threshold into the room. The light of a single burning splinter does not reveal a whole space. It merely carves a small, yellow hole out of the black. In that narrow circle of light, he saw that the woman he had followed was already turning back into the elements of the earth, her form becoming a soft, dissolving shadow where the skin had gone gray and damp with the rot of the soil. In the mysterious economy of the underworld, the markers of decay were described by the ancient scribes as 8 distinct thunder gods, flickering in the hollows of her bones. Though one might read them now not as literal deities, but as the pale, purple flash of unvoiced lightning, the quiet, visual sound of a physical form coming slowly apart in the dark. The story does not linger on his terror, moving instead with the quick, practical stride of a man who realizes he has committed an error that cannot be undone by argument. Izanagi turned and fled back toward the light, and the things that inhabited the house rose up from the floor to follow him through the narrow tunnels. He did not defeat them with a sword or a magic phrase. As he reached the upper world, at the place where the path flattens out into the gray light of the living, he found a wild tree that was heavy with peaches. He gathered 3 of them from the branches and threw them into the mouth of the dark behind him, and the shadows fell back into the tunnel, confused by the sudden, bright smell of the orchard. It is an odd detail, a quiet reminder that in the oldest days, the barrier between life and death was not maintained by grand theological decrees, but by the simple, sour weight of summer fruit. At the very throat of the pass, where the mountain forest grows thick and the air is always cool, Izanagi found a stone so large it would have required 1,000 men to move it across the dirt. He rolled it against the opening, sealing the underworld away from the sun, and from the other side of the boulder, her voice came to him one last time, no longer through a wooden door, but through the immense, unyielding density of the mountain. "If you do this," she said, her voice muffled by the rock, "I will strangle 1,000 of your people each day." "If you do that," he replied, his breath coming hard against the cold face of the stone, "I will cause 1,500 to be born each day." It was a cold ledger, an accounting style that has governed the world ever since, ensuring that the light always stays just slightly ahead of the dark. The rock still sits on the edge of the Izumo country, in the small town they call Aya. If you go there on a Tuesday afternoon, you will see 3 large boulders resting under the deep shade of ancient cedars, where a wooden mailbox now stands, painted a soft, clean white. People from across the provinces come to drop letters into its slot, addressed to those who have gone behind the stone, and the white paint catches the low mountain light while the wind moves through the cedar needles with a small, dry hiss. The square envelope slips from the fingers, falling into the dark below with a single, muted thud, and then the forest returns to its steady, unbroken quiet. From the water, he washed his face, and 3 great children were born. From the water he washed his face, and 3 great children were born. It is a recurring rhythm in the older layers of memory that before a new order can be established, the old dust must be thoroughly dissolved and given back to the stream. Having rolled the heavy boulder across the throat of the dark pass, sealing his dead wife into the gray clay of the underworld, Izanagi found himself standing on the coast of Tsukushi, at a place the early scribes called the small river mouth of Tachibana in Odo. The air down here was different from the heavy soot of the lower country. It was sharp with the salt of the open sea, and the cold, clean movement of a river that had traveled through miles of high pine forest to meet the tide. He stripped away his garments, letting the clothes that had touched the house of the dead fall into the dry beach grass. And as each robe touched the sand, the old records note that new, minor deities stepped out from the cloth, though these were merely the small, quiet preludes to the washing that was about to take place in the current. He walked out into the middle of the stream, choosing a place where the water was neither too swift at the surface nor too stagnant at the bottom, but where the river moved with a steady, cooling density that could carry away the invisible film of his grief. The act of mizogi, the thorough rinsing of the skin to reset the mind to its early, unblemished boundaries, began with the body, but its true work was finished when he raised his hands to his face. As he cupped the transparent water and washed his left eye, a sudden, warm radiance spilled across the surface of the river, and from that brightness emerged Amaterasu, the goddess who was given the great, noisy task of governing the high meadows of heaven. Then, Shifting his hands to rinse his nose, the air grew thick with the smell of salt spray and brewing storms as Susanoo was born, a restless deity who immediately turned his eyes toward the gray horizons of the sea. Yet it was between these two immense, clamorous forces, at the exact moment Izanagi brought the river water to wash his right eye, that the third child came into the light. They called him Tsukuyomi, the moon god, who was commanded to step back from the sun and take rule over the long, silent kingdoms of the night. The old chronicles, which usually grow grand and verbose when describing the arguments of the sun or the violent steps of the storm, become remarkably thin when they turn their brushes toward this second sun. While Amaterasu was given a mirror and a sacred palace, and Susanoo began his long, weeping complaints that would eventually tear the thatch from the roofs, Tsukuyomi was simply told to govern the realm of night. And then, for several long scrolls, the text simply leaves him alone in the dark. This sudden economy of words has often drawn the eyes of those who read the myth centuries later. The scholars of the 20th century, seeking to understand the unique architecture of the country's ancient stories, noted that at the very center of these grand family disputes sits a deity who does nothing at all, representing what they called a hollow structure, a deliberate clearing where the balance of the world is maintained not by action, but by a quiet, unoccupied absence. One might read this not as a failure of the ancient imagination, but as a deep and early aesthetic choice. The realization that for a landscape to remain in harmony, it requires a vast space of yohaku, an intentional margin of silence where the ink does not touch the paper and the world is allowed to breathe without being commanded. In that quiet kingdom of the night, Tsukuyomi ruled without leaving the marks of his own weight upon the ground. The old accounts suggest a realm where the ordinary business of living was suspended, a long period of mui, where the absence of doing became the very thing that kept the seasons from colliding with one another. If you had looked out over the archipelago during those ancient nights, you would have heard only the very small, precise movements of a world that was resting from the glare of the sun. The cold night dew gathering on the long blades of the mountain bamboo, the slow, silver distortion of the tide as the moon altered its shape above the headlands, and the soft sound of water soaking into the mossy earth. It was a world that existed purely in the passive voice, an immense, cool shadow where there were no laws to obey and no wars to win, because the ruler himself remained entirely still within his dark palace, letting the night settle around the trees according to its own ancient nature. This profound stilling has remained an anchor for the imagination, surviving through the centuries to emerge in the peculiar corners of modern fantasy. When the animators and storytellers of the new century sought a name for a power that could completely freeze the human mind, trapping it within an unbreakable, timeless illusion where the ordinary rules of the physical world no longer applied, they turned back to this silent god, using the name Tsukuyomi as the ultimate anchor for a technique of absolute mental darkness. It is an odd survival, a sign that the bottomless quiet of that ancient night world still carries a slight, cold fascination for an age that is noisy with machines. But in the story itself, before the poets and the animators had broken the myth into pieces, this space of absolute non-action was not an illusion at all. It was a necessary and beautiful pause, a long, cool breath taken by the earth before the first blade was drawn in the light. And yet, the very perfection of that silence was the very thing that made it fragile, a dry and clean boundary that could not endure a single drop of human blood without coming completely apart at the seams. The quiet god raised his blade once, and the sun never looked at him again. The quiet god raised his blade once, and the sun never looked at him again. In the long, unraveling tapestry of these ancient accounts, the fragile nature of absolute stillness is almost always tested by a sudden, jarring movement, a single moment where the passive voice of the world is forced into the active by the weight of a sudden offense. Having been given the long hours of the night to govern, Tsukuyomi, by most accounts, had remained within the gray margins of his cool kingdom, maintaining the balance of the early earth by the simple, steady act of doing nothing at all, letting the moon grow thick and thin against the black pines according to its own hidden measure. Yet, the old scribes were rarely content to leave a god entirely in the dark without testing the clean edges of his temper. It was the goddess of the sun, Amaterasu, who eventually disturbed her brother's long retreat, requesting that he travel down from the high meadows of heaven to the lower plains of the living world to visit Ukemochi, the ancient deity who held the keys to the earth's deep storehouses of food. When Tsukuyomi arrived at the house of the food goddess, he found a realm that was thick with the heavy, rich smells of a newly turned harvest, a place where the dirt itself seemed to be breathing with the warmth of things preparing to grow. To welcome her heavenly guest, Ukemochi turned her face to the wild fields and began to produce a great feast. But she did not gather the grain from the stalks or pull the roots from the soil in the ordinary manner of the living. Instead, she drew the food directly from the dark interior of her own physical form, turning her mouth and her hands toward the mats to yield dishes that were fragrant with the salt of the sea and the sweetness of the mountain valleys. In some versions of the story, the old text details these logistics with a dry, biological precision that can trouble a modern ear, describing how the fish and the game were brought forth from her throat and her body. But the core of the event remains a study in the sudden collision of two entirely different worlds. Tsukuyomi, whose entire existence had been defined by the clean, unblemished cold of the night water, looked down at the steaming platters and saw only a profound and intolerable pollution, an act of hospitality that felt like a direct insult to the absolute purity he had maintained in the long silence of his moonlit kingdom. It is here, at the absolute turning point of the legend, that the ancient texts present us with their most complicated administrative knot, a historical contradiction that has occupied the brushes of scholars for hundreds of years. The compilers of Kojiki, looking back through the traditions of the great families, insisted that it was not the moon god who committed the slaughter at all, but rather his wild, storm-driven brother, Susanoo, who struck down the food deity, whom they called Ogetsuhime, in a fit of sudden, unguided anger. Yet when the scribes of the Nihon Shoki assembled their grand, official history for the eyes of foreign courts, they chose to give this single, terrible action to Tsukuyomi instead, marking it as the only time the quiet god ever raised his hand in the light. For those who seek a peaceful path into the dark of sleep, it is this second account that offers the more striking weight, revealing the image of a god whose very cleanliness becomes a form of violence, a deity so entirely locked within his own requirement for purity that he cannot endure the messy, biological abundance of the living earth. The blow itself was delivered without any long speeches or dramatic warnings, moving with the cold, practical efficiency of a winter frost. Tsukuyomi drew his sword, and in that single, sharp motion, the food goddess was brought down into the dirt. Her long breath leaving her body in a final, quiet sigh that smelled faintly of parched rice. Yet, in the logic of these early stories, the death of a god is rarely an end. It is more often a redirection of the world's hidden wealth, a collapse that allows the landscape to reshape its own borders. As her physical form grew cold under the shadow of his blade, her body did not simply rot into the gray soil, but began instead to dissolve into a slow, shimmering cloud of light particles, her flesh turning back into the raw elements of human survival. From her head, where the hair had been long and dark, there emerged the pale, silver turnings of the first silkworms, spinning their silk in the grass, while from her eyes, which had looked upon the sun, two streams of golden rice seeds tumbled out onto the wet earth. From her ears came the tiny, hard grains of millet. From her nose, the red seeds of the adzuki bean, and from her lower body, the heavy, bearded heads of wheat and barley rolled into the clay with a sound like dry pebbles falling into a well. Tsukuyomi turned away from that sudden, quiet harvest, returning up the long paths of the sky to report what he had done. But when Amaterasu looked at the blood on her brother's sleeve, the old text tells us that her face grew dark with an anger that was entirely hot and clean. She refused to look upon its face again, declaring that the light and the shadow could no longer occupy the same clearing without the world coming apart at the center. And so she took her long herds of horses and moved to the opposite side of the day, leaving him the wide, empty fields of the night. It was the origin of the world's great division, the moment the day was permanently parted from the evening, establishing a distance that no traveler could ever bridge. Long afterward, the writers who looked back at this absolute separation would note that the moon god's single action had cost him his place in the great family of heaven, leaving him to rule over a kingdom that was entirely beautiful and entirely solitary. If you look up at the sky on a clear night in late autumn, you can still see the geometry of that ancient argument. The moon rises in its cold, silver silence only after the last yellow trace of the sun has sunk beneath the hills. A solitary traveler who must always move through the dark alone, checking the borders of an empty world that he bought with a single stroke of his blade. When the sun grew afraid, she closed the door behind her. When the sun grew afraid, she closed the door behind her. In the long, circular memory of the early world, the preservation of light is never a permanent guarantee, occurring instead as a fragile balance that can be completely shattered when the wild, unguided forces of the landscape refuse to adjust themselves to the heavy rules of the house. Following the permanent division of the day and the night, the high meadows of heaven had enjoyed a period of orderly warmth, but the text soon turns its brush toward the gathering weight of a domestic disaster, brought down upon the celestial fields by the restless, storm-driven brother, Susanoo. He did not move with the calculated coldness that had caused Tsukuyomi to draw his blade in the dark, moving instead with the blind, scattering fury of an autumn gale that respects no boundaries. The ancient accounts tell us that the shadow of his long defiance eventually fell upon the sacred weaving hall where Amaterasu sat with her maidens, weaving the heavy garments of the seasons. The raw violence of the gale did not leave a bloody stain upon the scrolls, being remembered instead through a quiet, symbolic displacement, as the ancient scribes recorded that the shadow of the storm simply broke through the roof and tore the threads from the looms, completely unraveling the delicate, holy harmony of the weaving house before the sun could raise her hand to restore the order. The retreat of the goddess from this sudden chaos was finished without any grand speeches or dramatic gestures, moving with the heavy, unhurried stride of a setting sun that has grown tired of looking at the dirt. Amaterasu fled from the broken hall and sought the absolute isolation of the heavenly rock dwelling, rolling a great stone across the opening to seal herself away from the weight of her brother's offenses. The effect upon the universe was immediate and profound, a sudden, suffocating drop in the world's temperature that caused the grass along the ridges to turn gray with an early frost. The light vanished from the rice terraces and the river mouths simultaneously, leaving the millions of deities to inhabit a silent, frozen twilight, where the only movement was the rising of their own white breath, gathering like thick mountain fog over the gravel beds of the tranquil river of heaven. It was a crisis of stillness, a long, dark winter where the ordinary rhythm of life had come to a permanent stop, leaving the gods to sit shoulder to shoulder in the dark, waiting for a sign that the order of the world could be mended from within the clearing. The strategy to draw the sun back into the light was assembled not by a displays of military strength, but by a curious, theatrical deception that treated the cosmic disaster with a peculiar, domestic lightness. The millions of gods gathered before the sealed stone, bringing with them a vast, curved mirror made of white bronze and a long tree pulled from the mountain forest. But the true turning point of the night belonged to a minor goddess named Ame no Uzume, who overturned a wooden tub before the cave and began to dance upon its hollow base. It is here that the ancient records require a careful, dual reading from anyone who turns their pages, because the memory of her performance remains deeply divided between the two great chronicles. The compilers of Kojiki wrote that she danced with a wild, unrestrained humor, shedding her garments to invite the millions of deities into a roaring, earth-shaking burst of laughter that rattled the frozen pine trees along the ridge. Yet, when the formal scribes of the Nihon Shoki recorded the same hour, they chose to pass over this ribald display, writing instead that she performed her mime with a quiet, polished artistry, using her wooden flutes and her steps to move the assembly through the sheer excellence of her skill. The laughter of the gods, echoing through the cold dark of the ravine, eventually reached the interior of the stone house, stirring a small, human curiosity within the mind of the hidden goddess. Amaterasu moved toward the seam of the rock, asking how the assembly could find such immense amusement in a universe that had been completely drained of its light. And the voice of the actors returned to her through the dark, telling her that a new and far more radiant deity had just arrived on the gravel beds to take her place. It was a shallow, malicious trick, the kind of domestic deceit that would seem small in a modern epic, but the old texts handle the moment with a dry, quiet humor. As the gods slid the bronze mirror into the narrow crack of the door, the sun goddess looked into the dark metal and saw the reflection of her own immense brightness, mistaking her own face for the arrival of her rival. This slight, human vanity was the only opening the world required. As she leaned forward to peer more closely into the gray surface of the bronze, a god of immense physical strength hidden beside the ledge caught her by the hand, pulling her out into the open air, while another threw a rope of plaited straw behind her back to seal the gate forever. The light returned to the fields of heaven with the sudden, quiet warmth of a spring morning, washing the frost from the long blades of the bamboo and letting the rivers find their old, silver paths through the sand. The turbulent storm god was cast out into the lower country, his weapons stripped from his frame, and the great assembly of the deities began to scatter back to their separate valleys, leaving the rock dwelling to stand empty under the open sky. In that ancient ravine, the heavy, dark mouth of the cave split the gray rock face, completely surrounded by the thick roots of the wild cedars that had grown over the abandoned path. The white bronze mirror had been taken away into the dark of the long corridors, and as the afternoon light faded behind the ridges, the only remaining movement was the slow, silent sliding of the shadows across the empty clearing, where the earth held its breath under a blue and newly recovered sky. He poured the wine and waited for the great serpent to sleep. He poured the wine and waited for the great serpent to sleep. In the long memory of the valleys, the transition from the absolute clarity of the heavenly fields to the heavy, mud-stained reality of the lower earth is almost always marked by the arrival of a deity who has been stripped of his grand titles and forced to walk through the damp river grass like an ordinary man. Having been completely cast out from the high meadows of heaven for his turbulent ways, Susanoo descended into the Izumo country, finding himself standing beside the upper reaches of the Hikawa River, where the water did not run clear like the streams of the sky, but carried instead a thick, reddish clay that stained the reeds along the bank. It was a landscape that felt burdened by its own weight, smelling faintly of wet slate and the raw iron that lay hidden in the deep veins of the mountains. There was no poetry in the air down here, only the practical necessity of survival and the slow, weeping lament of an elderly couple who sat on the river shingles with their daughter, waiting for the shadow that came down from the ridges every autumn to claim the last of their blood. The old stories have a habit of turning these moments into grand spectacles of divine courage. But the older layers of the text reveal an encounter that was far more calculating, a study in the practical, pragmatic intelligence that men must use when they find themselves looking into the jaws of a disaster they cannot hope to match with raw strength alone. Susanoo did not draw his great sword and march up the mountain to meet the eight-headed serpent, Yamata no Orochi, in the open air. Instead, he commanded the old people to build a fence of heavy timber that enclosed 8 separate gates, and within each gate they set a large wooden vat filled with a dark, heavy liquor that had been distilled 8 times over until it smelled of sweet, rotted fruit and old winter yeast. The scent was thick enough to sit upon the river mist, a heavy, suffocating perfume that drifted into the thickets of the pine forests, turning the entire valley into a vast, silent trap. Susanoo hid himself within the shadow of the wooden palisade, his hand resting upon the hilt of his 10-span sword, choosing to let the gravity of the liquor do the work that no army of early mortals could ever perform. The arrival of the serpent was announced not by a violent shaking of the earth, but by the slow, suffocating thickening of the light as its immense, low-slung body began to slide out from the gray clefts of the upper hills. The ancient scribes, struggling to find words for a shape that seemed to have no proper boundary, wrote that its length spanned 8 valleys and 8 peaks, its belly always red and raw from the friction of the mountain rocks, while its back grew a heavy coat of dark moss and stunted cedar trees, as if the landscape itself had grown tired of standing still and had begun to crawl down toward the sea. It carried 8 heads upon its great neck, each eye burning with a dull, vacant redness like the embers of a dying charcoal kiln. It did not display the intelligence of the heavenly gods. It moved with the dull, single-minded hunger of a winter marsh, its 8 mouths dropping down into the 8 wooden vats simultaneously, swallowing the thick, fermented wash with a rhythmic, gulping sound that echoed through the river gorge like the beating of wet drums. A warrior in the later epics might have struck while the beast was still drinking, seeking the glory of an open challenge, but Susanoo remained entirely still behind his wooden wall, watching with the dry, unblinking eye of a hunter who understands that the most effective victories are those bought without any unnecessary movement. He waited while the heavy yeast began to do its work within the great veins of the monster, watching as the 8 long necks began to lose their stiffness, dropping down one by one until they lay sprawled across the river pebbles, like rotted logs left behind by a spring flood. The great breathing of the serpent slowed down to a low, rhythmic vibration that shook the loose silt along the banks, its giant frame completely locked within that heavy, artificial sleep. Only when the silence had settled back over the Hikawa, deep and absolute under the mountain stars, did the cast-out god step from the shadows to finish the work he had prepared in the dark. Quick, methodical repetition, a cold and heavy labor that resembled the clearing of an old forest rather than the triumphs of a grand war. Susanoo walked along the rows of sleeping heads, raising his great bronze blade to sever each neck with a steady, unhurried stroke, and as the iron bit into the flesh, the river was turned into a thick, dark soup of red clay and old blood that filled the valley with the sharp, metallic tang of a smith's shop. His blade struck something unnaturally hard inside the thickest part of the serpent's tail, the edge of his own 10-span sword chipping away with a sharp, ringing sound that woke the birds in the nearby thickets. He reached into the gray flesh and pulled out a long, narrow blade of cold steel that shone with a pale, independent light. It was the Kusanagi sword, a weapon born from the very marrow of the earth's raw power, but he did not keep it to build a kingdom of his own on the lower plains. In accordance with the oldest traditions of the great families, he sent the blade up the long paths of the sky as a formal offering to his sister, Amaterasu, using the cold iron to mend the old seam that had been torn between the day and the night. The work was finished, and the red water carried the last remnants of the great shape out toward the open sea, leaving the shores of Izumo to find their own proper boundaries under the evening light. Along the banks of the Hikawa, the long, flat gravel beds divided the river into a dozen small, silver fingers, its waters running quiet and clean over the gray stones. The wooden palisade had been dismantled by the old people, and the great timber frames were gone from the sand. The air smelled only of wet slate and the cold bitterness of the mountain pine, and as the night came down over the ridges, the final remnants of the crimson stain disappeared into the wider current, leaving the valley to follow its own steady, unbroken silence beneath the stars. He had built the land with his own hands, and then they asked him to give it away. He had built the land with his own hands, and then they asked him to give it away. In the long, shifting governance of the lower world, the labor of making a landscape habitable is rarely rewarded by permanent possession, occurring instead as a temporary clearing where a mortal or a god is allowed to work the soil until the authorities in the sky decide that the lease has expired. For several generations, Okuninushi had traveled through the green provinces of Reed Plainland, moving without any great haste to pacify the wild elements of the earth, drawing the boundaries of the fields and discovering the secrets of medicine that could heal the early mortals from the small, bitter diseases of the marsh. It was a quiet interlude in the old scrolls, a period of steady construction where the air smelled of dry cedar bark and the gentle, sweet warmth of the soil under a long autumn peace. But the grand designs of heaven are seldom satisfied with the quiet prosperity of the valleys, and the messengers of Amaterasu eventually descended upon the shores of Izumo, planting a giant bronze sword hilt down into the sand as a silent, unyielding demand that the sovereignty of the earth be handed over to the children of the sun. While Okuninushi's elder sons chose to step back into the gray fog of the sea without an argument, bowing their heads to the divine negotiators, the old records preserve a single, fierce exception that broke the smooth logic of the treaty. It is here that the ancient texts require a careful, historic caution from anyone who handles their scrolls, because this final defense was not recorded by the official state compilers of the Nihon Shoki, who chose to pass over the matter in complete silence, leaving the story entirely to the more domestic pages of Kojiki. In that northern version of the memory, a younger son named Takeminakata arrived at the beach, his arms bearing an immense boulder that would have required several ordinary men to roll through the dirt as he issued a rough and arrogant challenge to Takemikazuchi, the fiercest martial deity of the heavenly court. It was the classic miscalculation of a local power that mistakes its own physical weight for divine favor. The celestial warrior simply allowed the youth to grasp his hand, turning his own fingers into a row of sharp steel blades and then into a spray of cold icicles, shattering the strength of the challenger with a single, passive movement that left the boy with nothing to hold but the damp air. The text does not dwell on the glory of the pursuit, turning away from the conventional rhythms of military triumph to follow the long, ragged flight of a god who had suddenly discovered the limits of his own immortality. Takeminakata turned his back on the wide sea of Izumo and fled toward the east, running through the high mountain passes and the unfamiliar forests with the frantic, stumbling gait of a creature that knows it is being hunted by something it cannot outrun. He traveled for days without a pause, his heavy breathing coming rough and thin through his chest until he reached the cold, mountain-rimmed province of Shinano, where the landscape was locked within the severe grip of an early winter. There, at the very edge of the deep water, they call Lake Sua, where the shore was lined with wet reeds and the thin ice along the margins made a sharp, splintering sound against the gray pebbles. The heavenly pursuer finally stepped out from the mountain mist, his shadow falling across the path like a long bar of iron. The encounter on that frozen shore was stripped of all the grand dignity that the later poets would try to give to the ancient gods, revealing instead a raw and unadorned vulnerability that brings the immortal down to the level of human panic. Pinched between the cold lake and the blade of his pursuer, the youth who had once carried mountains in his arms did not offer a final, heroic defiance. He fell into the wet silt of the bank, his limbs trembling with a fear that smelled of old mud and parched throat, and he began to beg for his life with the heavy, unguided sincerity of a child. He promised that he would never cross the borders of this cold valley again, that he would remain forever bound to the shores of the lake, an exile from the grand politics of Izumo, who would no longer challenge the title of the sun. It is a rare moment of absolute surrender in the old chronicles, an observation of a god who has been thoroughly broken by his own weakness. Yet it was this very collapse that allowed him to remain within the landscape, surviving not as a defeated enemy, but as a quiet, enduring presence that belonged permanently to the water and the mountain frost. The cosmic ledger was settled, and Okuninushi withdrew from the active governance of the day, retreating entirely from the sun into the vast, shadow-filled sanctuary that the early mortals built for him out of heavy timber, where the forked finials called chiji pierced the cloud-torn sky above the sands of Izumo. Far away in the high basin of Shinano, the deep waters of Lake Sua remained gray and still under the morning fog, surrounded by the steep, pine-covered ridges that held the valley isolate from the rest of the world. The youth remained within the shadow of the mountains, his long challenge forgotten on the distant beach, while the thin crust of winter ice along the shore gave a small, brittle click against the stones. The cold air settled back into the gray reeds, leaving the wide, dark expanse of the water to hold its own long and permanent retreat. And then the gods stepped back and let the world become ours. And then the gods stepped back and let the world become ours. In the long, unraveling architecture of these ancient accounts, the arrival of the first human ruler is rarely treated as a sudden conquest, occurring instead as a quiet, mist-shrouded transition where the immense shapes of the early sky gradually dissolve into the domestic habits of the soil. Having settled the cosmic accounts upon the sand of Izumo, the text turns its gaze back to the children of the sun, recording the moment Ninigi descended from the heavenly fields to take possession of the lower world. It is here that the ancient scrolls require a modern, historical care, because the compilers did not write these lines to serve as an academic log of an actual event, presenting them instead as a beautiful, poetic memory of how the early people found a sacred harmony between their daily lives and the great, invisible movements of the earth. He came down through the layers of the sky, wrapped in a heavy, protective cloth that kept his divinity hidden from the wind, arriving upon a mountain summit that was entirely buried within a dense and permanent fog. The old traditions have a stubborn habit of quarreling over the exact ground where that first heavenly foot was placed, creating a local division that has occupied the pride of the provinces for hundreds of years. The travelers who search the geography of the southern island will find two distinct peaks claiming the memory of the descent, with the old records of the northern district pointing toward the deep, green gorges of Takachiho town, while the formal logic of the later scribes leads the eye toward the high, volcanic ridges of the Kirishima Range. One might read this long dispute not as a contradiction to be solved by proof, but as a deliberate embrace of both, a sign that the ancient story belongs to no single valley or village, but remains instead a property of the mountain wind itself, which still blows across both summits with the same cool, pine-scented indifference. From that misty threshold, the grand, turbulent age of the deities began to recede, their immense voices growing thin as the generations moved toward the familiar scale of mortality, leaving the wide forests and the rivers to be managed by the hands of those who had to work the soil for their bread. Yet, as the last scroll of the creation is rolled up and put away in its box, the mind is almost always drawn back to the mysterious clearing that was left behind at the very beginning of the design. The scholars who spent their lives dissecting the hidden psychology of these stories often noted that while the sun goddess built her long palaces and the storm god broke the fences of the valleys, the entire weight of the myth was held steady by a god who chose to remain entirely absent from the argument. It was Tsukuyomi, the silent ruler of the night, who, in the telling we have followed, had accepted an absolute exile after his single, violent stroke against the food goddess, taking his place in the middle of the sky as a deity who did nothing at all, letting the moon grow thick and thin without ever issuing a command. Looking back from the distance of the 21st century, one might read this hollow structure not as a gap in the ancient memory, but as a profound and early aesthetic declaration. The suggestion that the world does not require a roaring engine at its center to remain true, but rather a vast, intentional margin of yohaku, an empty clearing of mui where the ink is held back and the mind is allowed to rest without being driven forward by the necessity of action. That ancient margin has not been built over by the centuries, surviving as a quiet, physical shadow that runs beneath the noise of the modern cities. If you travel across the provinces today, you will still encounter the small, unmovable markers of that early world, resting in the corners of the landscape like tools left behind in the grass. The white mailbox that sits in the cedar shade at Aya, catching the quiet letters of those who still wish to speak across the great rock of the dead, and the immense, gray wall of Hana no Iwaya, where the coast still gathers to hang its ropes of flowers against the bare stone. You will see it in the high, silent timber of the great sanctuary at Izumo, where the wind causes the cedar beams to groan with a deep, sea-borne weight, and in the green prohibition of Miwa Mountain, where there is no inner hall to enter, because the ridge itself remains entirely sacred and untouched by the brush. These are not dead curiosities preserved for the eye of the tourist, but the living remnants of an old agreement, a sign that the country still retains its ancient requirement for a space where nothing is done, a quiet reservation where the elements are left alone to follow their own nature. The stories have found their places in the dark, and the night has settled completely over the valleys. If you are still awake, there is another story waiting for you on the screen right now, ready to carry you out towards some other quiet threshold where the wind never stops. But for now, let your body go heavy against the mattress, and let your hands discover their own natural weight upon the sheets. The lanterns are dimmed in the long corridors. The small flutes have ended their music along the shore, and the night is quiet. Sleep well.